Welcome to the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity Grantee Training. In this presentation, we will be discussing indirect cost rates. Within this training, we will provide a brief overview of indirect costs, including examples. We will discuss the purpose of electing an indirect cost rate. We will outline the different types of indirect cost rates, how to submit your indirect cost rate, and where to find additional resources. To explain what an indirect cost rate is, we begin by uncovering the distinction between direct and indirect costs. Direct costs are directly related to the objective of the grant program. Direct costs are easily identifiable as being directly related to the overall goal of your project. Knowing this, we see that indirect costs are not easily identifiable as being part of the final cost objective. Indirect costs are related to support activities for the grant program. They can also ease the administrative burden of reporting costs. Grantees may encounter such indirect costs as the depreciation of buildings or equipment necessary for the grant program. Other indirect costs could include costs of operating and maintaining facilities such as utilities, pest control, or office equipment not directly linked to program objective. General administration and other expenses such as salaries for administrative staff, accounting, and personnel administration like human resources. Although none of these are the soul of the grant program, they are required to achieve the end goal. The state of Illinois implements the centralized indirect cost rate system maintained by GAT-2. GAT-2 is the Grant Accountability and Transparency Unit of the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, also known as GOMB. Indirect cost rates are also referred to as ICRs. This system is required to be used by all grantees to make an annual indirect cost rate election or negotiate a rate with the state of Illinois pursuant to federal uniform guidance. The state of Illinois centralized indirect cost rate system is the system of record for all grantee indirect cost rate elections and approvals used for reimbursement on state of Illinois and federal pass-through awards. The purpose of indirect cost election is to determine the appropriate or fair amount of indirect funding for which each program should be reimbursed. This calculation uncovers the proper ratio between total indirect expenses and the direct cost base. The indirect cost rate system is required to be used by all grantees to make an annual indirect cost rate election or negotiate a rate with the state of Illinois pursuant to federal uniform guidance and is adopted by the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act. Indirect cost rate elections apply to all non-federal entities seeking reimbursement from funding entities including nonprofits, for-profits, institutions of higher education, hospitals, and units of local governments. Indirect cost rates allowed by the state of Illinois include federally negotiated indirect cost rate agreement or federal NICRA, state federal rate maintained internally, or state FRMI. State negotiated indirect cost rate or state NICRA, de minimis rate of up to 15%, waived rates, or special program-specific rates. Entities should review the requirements of each of the options to determine if they are eligible and/or if they can comply and provide the required information before they make an election. Federally negotiated rates apply to grant programs in receipt of $35 million or more in direct funding from the federal government. Although the rate is federal, it is honored by the state of Illinois. Like other indirect cost rates, elections must be made in the GATA grantee portal. For federally negotiated rates, this election requires a copy of the federal NICRA, as well as the most recent Cost Policy Statement or CPS for review and recording purposes. The state federal rate maintained internally, or state FRMI, is an option available only to local governments who have received less than $35 million in direct federal funds. Local governments are to submit a copy of their FMRI as well as indirect cost rate proposal when electing this rate, and annually for review. The state NICRA requires grantees to develop and submit their indirect cost rate proposal, or ICRP, to the state of Illinois annually for review. In addition, the state negotiated rate requires a cost policy statement, an organizational chart, the most current audit report, and a spreadsheet showing indirect cost rate calculations. This spreadsheet is available on the GAT-2 resource page. You can access this spreadsheet by visiting gata.illinois.gov/resources. The state NICRA will be effective for the duration of the grantee's fiscal year. Those with state NICRAs are required to resubmit their indirect cost rate proposal annually. Nonprofit and for-profit entities in receipt of federal funding who are refused negotiation by their federal cognizant agency must submit correspondence or communication demonstrating this in order to qualify for state NICRA. The 15% de minimis rate is the most frequently used rate by grantees. This rate allows 15% of modified total direct costs, or MTDC. Local governments can only elect the 15% de minimis rate if their federal cognizant agency refused to negotiate a rate with them. In this case, the grantee must submit correspondence or communication that demonstrates the refusal to negotiate to qualify for this rate. Grantees may use this rate while their state or federal NCRA is being negotiated. Grantees may elect to waive their indirect cost rate. In these cases, grantees may voluntarily decline an indirect cost rate. This communicates that the grantee will not seek reimbursement for any state or federal pass-through awards. There may be programs with a specific rate that a grantee may elect to use unless they have already negotiated a rate. For example, Small Business Administration allows grantees to use the indirect rate of 24% for Small Business Development Center grants. This rate is exclusive to this program and cannot be used on other federally funded grants. Educational entities, such as the Illinois State Board of Education, or ISB, had full right to negotiate indirect rates for schools. When determining if you can be reimbursed for indirect costs, grantees will review the Notice of Funding Opportunity to determine if reimbursements are allowed. If indirect costs are allowed, they are to be submitted in the application budget. Some programs have program-specific rates or caps that might be applicable, and some programs do not allow indirect reimbursement at all. Once an agreement is executed, you can review the executed budget to remind you of what rate was agreed upon. On the rare occasion, a grantee with an active grant award may have elected to waive their indirect cost rate. In this example, 6 months into their grant program, the grantee selects a federally negotiated rate. In cases like these, the grantee may request reimbursement for expenditures they incurred during the previous 6 months when their indirect cost rate was waived. Reimbursement for those expenditures is not guaranteed, as it is dependent on the availability of funds. The key to indirect cost rates is consistency. Once you select a rate in the system, you must utilize that rate for all grants unless there is a program-specific rate, a program doesn't allow indirect costs, or you choose to waive indirect reimbursement for a particular grant program. It is recommended that the indirect cost rate election be performed by your organization's fiscal team or by outsourcing the process to a financial organization. This helps to ensure that all costs have been considered and the correct rate is elected. As with every part of the grant process, it is extremely important to maintain thorough record keeping and account for everything. The GAT2 resource page contains a special section with additional information about indirect cost rates. You can review this section by visiting gata.illinois.gov/resources. You may also visit the grantee resource page by scanning the QR code with your mobile device or by visiting dceo.illinois.gov/dceo-grants. Thank you for watching this presentation on indirect cost rates. If you have any questions, please reach out to ceo.granthelp@illinois.gov.